Good evening, Mr. Phelps. According to our sources in British intelligence, with the BBC, the men who endured years of suffering in Japanese prisoner of war camps during World War II had come to think of themselves as the forgotten army. Yet many of the survivors, when they came back, never spoke of what they had seen and suffered. However, in February 2010, one survivor of the camps had broken his 65-year silence. Alistair Cooked, then a 22-year-old Gordon Highlander from Aberdeen, became a prisoner of war without firing a shot. Some additional details may assist you, Mr. Phelps, in assembling your team, should you choose to accept this mission. On August 6, 2015, Revel Alderson, a BBC Scotland social affairs correspondent, reported to British audiences that the atomic bombs dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 killed up to 250,000 people, but they are credited with hastening the end of World War II. According to BBC correspondents, Mr. Phelps, Aberdeen-born Mr. Cooked, of Broughty Ferry, died in a Dundee care home in October 2016, but his story began when Singapore fell to the Japanese in February 1942. And, serving with the Gordon Highlanders 2nd Battalion, he had arrived there just weeks earlier as the Allies strengthened the island fortress against the expected invasion. He was among thousands taken prisoner and ended up helping to build the notorious Burma-Siam Railway. Young Alistair Cooked's detail was put to work in what became known as a Hellfire Pass, where men were forced to cut through solid rock using nothing more than hand tools and dynamite. It is estimated that at least 13,000 Allied POWs died on the railway. When it was completed, the surviving prisoners were taken back to Singapore to be put on ships to Japan. However, unfortunately, the Americans, not knowing the cargo, torpedoed them. And the ship young Alistair Cooked was on sank. For 5 days he drifted on the ocean in a raft, until he was picked up by a whaler. Young Alistair Cooked ended up in a labor camp 10 miles from Nagasaki where, on August 9, 1945, the second atomic bomb exploded. Young Alistair had recalled, "I heard a plane, and I looked up. And it was quite clearly an American plane. No opposition." And this same Alistair Cooked, a Scot who witnessed the bomb dropped on Nagasaki, says it saved his life because it prevented a Japanese plan to massacre Allied prisoners of war from being carried out. This is a little bit more than a history lesson, Mr. Phelps, and, at least for persons in Britain, the name of a young lad named Alistair Cooked, a 22-year-old Gordon Highlander from Aberdeen, should be a familiar name, for those who remember their history, not doomed to repeat it. And this is the problem that has recently come to the attention of our intelligence sources regarding another appearance of an Alistair Cooked, now aged 21, who had captured some considerable attention at the beginning of pandemic, but not for surviving a nuclear blast or a prisoner of war camp. Meet Fergus Walsh. Fergus became the BBC's medical editor in 2020. As medical correspondent since 2004, he has reported on medical and health issues of the day, especially those involving research and ethics. He covered global disease threats such as bird flu, swine flu, SARS and MERS, both coronaviruses, and Ebola. Since COVID-19 came along, he has focused on reporting the global pandemic. So, we may assume that Fergus possesses some knowledge regarding infectious disease, and, beginning with the BBC during the pandemic in 2020, he should have become a subject matter expert, because it was the only major health story dominating the news, and, on August 22, 2020, during the first summer of the pandemic, Fergus had reported that there were plenty who would, and indeed were actually campaigning to be allowed to take part in so-called challenge trials to try to accelerate development of a coronavirus vaccine. As we know, The vaccines in the United States were not released under the emergency use authorization until December 2020, when they had already been in development and testing, which is the first problem with this account. However, in late August 2020, Fergus had reported that a certain Alistair Cooked was one of the volunteers, lining up to take part in a human experiment, in which volunteers would be intranasally inoculated with live, wild virus to help in the development of vaccines that had already been in development, and, while certainly of majority age, then just 18, this Alistair Cooked was one of them, and had just received his A-level results. Initially he did not have the grades he needed to study cancer biomedicine at University College London, until the British government U-turn, permitting him to continue his studies. But, perhaps excited about science, as a pre-medical student, and inundated with news about the biggest health story certainly in his lifetime, abruptly, hearing about the challenge study, he decided quite suddenly, and rashly, to take a year out, in part to work with One Day Sooner, a group campaigning for COVID vaccine challenge trials. A group called One Day Sooner demanding challenge trials for vaccines already in development and on their way to release to the general public raises many questions in itself, and, as Fergus from BBC had reported at that time, there were already at least 30 experimental vaccines in human trials. Nor when he contacted this young Alistair to cover a story did it appear that he had informed him of this, because, obviously excited, and perhaps naive, young Alistair, just 18 years old, told BBC, "I'm in the lowest risk category for COVID, so why wouldn't I make that choice and help save other people who would deal with it far worse than me?" At least young Alistair was aware at the time that his risk of becoming a fatality after infection from the virus was very low, since he was well below the age of 65, and possessed no comorbidities, far more awareness, apparently, than Captain Brett Crozier, the commander of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, who had sent out an SOS to the world when an outbreak had erupted aboard his nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And, young Alistair, thinking about himself as a hero, like an astronaut, told Fergus, at BBC, "It's fair to say they were not over the moon about it, but I haven't faced any significant opposition. My dad was definitely not chuffed when I told him in June. Both my brothers are okay with it." It is probably safe to assume that young Alistair's parents should have known that there were already vaccines being rushed through development, which may have given them some cause for concern. However, what we are most interested in is why, a reporter like Fergus, who appeared to be very excited about the development of the vaccines, did not make young Alistair aware, or seem to care, that no human challenge studies are required to develop safe and effective vaccines, especially since the advances in medical technology products that had developed E6 Vero Cells, making this process entirely safe, and avoiding unnecessary loss of lives. And, certainly today, with more knowledge about the risks of long COVID, about which Virginia Governor Ralph Northam, a medical doctor and pediatrician, had spoken of during his interview with the Virginia pilot reporter Elisha Sowers, after he had left office, and spoke of his loss of taste and smell, encouraging even young people to get vaccinated, as well as the now known increased risks of adverse outcomes for those suffering reinfections. It is at least puzzling as to why this reporter at BBC, Fergus Walsh, had elected a right to remain silent, and not protect this young man from doing something quite rash. And, why did the BBC not report about the doctors, like Dr. Ben Killingsley, who had led this human experimentation, and who had delayed the reporting of his findings until March 31, 2022, long after even bivalent boosters were being distributed? Your mission, Mr. Phelps, should you decide to accept it, is to gather your team to perform some research, and ask some probing questions to determine how this could have occurred, and why. As always, should you or any of your impossible mission force be caught or killed, the Secretary will disavow any knowledge of your actions. This tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Good luck, Jim.
This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.